We're almost there. This is lesson 24. And after this one, there are just 2 more lessons to go. In this lesson, I will explain setting up a basic FTP server. We'll first go through the process in general, and next you'll learn how to set up an FTP server for anonymous downloads. That's not hard to do, but it's all you need to know while on the exam. Next you'll work on a short exercise. I will summarize the topics reviewed in this lesson and we'll be done. So let's talk about FTP. On Red Hat Enterprise Linux, VS-FTPD is the default FTP server. And there's a couple of things that you should be aware of when doing FTP configuration. First of all is of course that there's a configuration file. There's a bunch of configuration files and you can find them in the directory VS-FTPD. And the most important configuration file is vsftpd.conf. I will explain in the next sub-lesson how to make your configuration in there. But before doing that, I want you to be aware of the difference between 2 different kinds of FTP users. So there is first the anonymous user, and then users can also do authentication before using the FTP server. So let's call them the authenticated user. The difficult thing is in the anonymous user, because the anonymous user is a user that can access an FTP site without any rights. But he needs access to files anyway. And in order to do that, there is the directory /var/FTP. This is the document root for FTP. And what you can see is that this is also the home directory of a user that exists on your system with the name FTP. So the idea is that whenever an anonymous user accesses the FTP server, it will get access to the home directory of the FTP user. But this home directory of the FTP user is owned by user root and group root, and the others entity has read and execute rights only. And that is a perfect way of ensuring that the anonymous user really can't do much to the files that he finds in this directory, except for downloading them, of course. So that is the thing that I want you to be aware of before starting to configure FTP. The anonymous user files are in this directory, and the access rights by default are good as they are.
The FTP server that is used by default on a Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7 is VS-FTPD. And you can install it by typing yum install -y VS-FTPD. The package is not big and installation just takes a little moment. So after installing the server, you should of course make sure that the server is enabled. You don't have to start it yet. You can take care of that later. So systemctl enable VS-FTPD just makes the symbolic links into the multi-user target ones, which makes sure that the FTP server comes up all the time that you enter this environment. And the next thing is that you need to find the configuration file. Do you remember rpm-ql, which is a great way to find what exactly is in a package. So -ql gives all the files, and as that is a bit too much in this case, you can do rpm-qc as well. And that will show you the etc directory within it a directory with the name vsftpd that contains a file with the name vsftpd.conf. So let's edit that one. Now configuring the FTP server for anonymous downloads really is easy because it is already enabled by default. some other important parameters. There is local enable equals yes, which is a parameter that allows users to download files from their own home directory. But in order to do that, you need to set an SLinux boolean. You'll learn more about it in the SLinux lesson. We're not covering that here. Write enable is yes, is what you need for authenticated users to be able to write files in their directory. In the case that you would want your anonymous users to upload as well, well, I think it's a bad idea, but if you want it, you can do it by enabling this parameter and on upload enable equals yes. So basically there's nothing that needs to be changed in this directory. That means that at this point you can use systemctl start vs ftpd to start a service. Let's just verify that it's really up and running by typing systemctl status vs ftpd. And as you can see, it is currently running. It's all good. So if you want to connect to this, you can use any FTP client utility, but you need to be aware as an administrator of the server where the files are stored that are accessible for the anonymous FTP user. What we need to find out is which is the home directory of the user FTP. So I'm doing a grep of FTP on etc passwd, and you can see that the home directory of this user is /var/ftp. Let's go to var ftp and check the contents. There's a pub directory which looks like a nice place for an anonymous user, and if you want you can copy a file in there, like the etc host file for example. Now at this point all that needs to be done is test the connectivity. I like the LFTP client a lot for that. Of course you can use wget if you know which exact file to download, but LFTP is a nice FTP client that allows you to browse around a little and see what your FTP server has to offer. And that is exactly what you need on the exam if you want to do a test to see that it all works well. So what I'm doing, I'm using LFTP on localhost, which connects me to localhost. Let's do an ls, and you can see that there's a pub directory. So we have arrived in the home directory of this FTP user, where we can see the hosts file. And this is proof enough that the configuration has worked. Your FTP server is all up and running.
Now that you know all you have to know about FTP, let's do an exercise. In this exercise, I would like you to configure an FTP server for anonymous downloads. Make sure it is enabled in your default firewall zone and that SLinux doesn't block any anonymous downloads.
So the exercise is to configure an FTP server for anonymous downloads. That shouldn't be too hard, but you also need to make sure that it is enabled in your default firewall zone and SLinux doesn't block anonymous downloads. So let's start by doing rpm-qa pipe grep vs-ftp. rpm-qa gives a list of all installed packages, and I grab that on vs-ftp just to see that vs-ftpd hasn't been installed. So I need to do yum install -y vs-ftpd, which is going to install the vs-ftpd FTP service. Now we want to configure for anonymous downloads, which is easy, but we should check anyway that every condition is met. So I'm going to the etc vs-ftpd directory. I do an ls to see the vs-ftpd.conf file. And let's have a look at its contents and verify that anonymous enable equals yes, so anonymous download is already enabled and we don't need to do anything else, so there's no configuration whatsoever that I need to change in this file. What I do need to do is systemctl enable vs-ftpd. which makes sure that it will start up after a restart of this system again. Now let's just make sure that systemctl status vsftpd is showing me enabled, and it does show me enabled, and it also shows me that it has been started and stopped a couple of times, but it currently is inactive, dead. Wow, that sounds seriously, but that is only because I just didn't start it yet. So systemctl start vsftpd would take care of that. Now we want to do a test as well, and in order to do the test, well, we need the anonymous user to be able to download something. So the first thing I need to do is to find out what exactly the anonymous user is getting to, I mean directory wise. So I want to put a file in some directory and test it as an anonymous user, and to find out which directory I should use, I'm using grep FTP on etc passwd to find out the home directory of the FTP user, which is var FTP. So if I go to var FTP, then I can see that there's a pub directory, and that sounds anonymous enough for me. So let's create a file. Hello anonymous user. So the FTP service is running, and that should be good. But before I test it, I should also test the firewall. So that would be firewall -cmd list all, which is giving me the default firewall zone, which is DMZ, but we can see that FTP is enabled. Now the other question was to take care of SE-Linux. So typically SE-Linux doesn't block anonymous downloads. Let's have a look. Get enforce shows us that SE-Linux is enforcing. Now in order to be able to download the file, it should be labeled as public contents T, which is the case. And getSubul -a is showing us all booleans, and we grab that on FTP just to make sure that there's nothing that is blocking anonymous downloads. So you can see there is an anon write which is off, but I don't care about it. I don't want to write, I just want to download files. So now I'm going to the TMP directory before starting my FTP test, which by the way needs the lftp utility. So yum install -y lftp. Well, you don't really need lftp in order to do the test, but I like it a lot because it's a very simple and convenient utility. Now I'm doing lftp on localhost, which connects me to localhost automatically as an anonymous user. And in here I can see the Haya file that I just created. I do a get on this file and it will download it to the current directory. And that is all fine, which concludes this exercise.
And this brings us to the end of lesson 24. In this lesson you have learned how to set up an FTP server. Again, same as for the lesson about Apache, it wasn't very complicated, but the purpose of setting up an FTP server for RHCSA is just that you know how to provide basic functionality.